Okay, today we are going to talk about flows of wealth and how people get rich. Okay, so wealth, what it is, who owns it, and how it flows around the economy is something which is almost not taught at all in university economics courses. And for that reason, many economists don't think about it very much. This means that if you understand it, you can have an advantage over most economists and you can understand the economy much more clearly than a lot of economists do. It's super important to understand it because the wealth distribution has changed massively in the last 20 years. I think that has really dominated changes in the economy, and understanding the way that wealth moves around has basically enabled me to predict better than economists after the 2008 crisis and also here in the COVID crisis. So if you understand this, you can understand what's happening in the economy and what you need to do basically to protect your family and your financial interests. So number one, you need to understand what wealth is. Wealth is not income. Whenever we talk about wealth on this channel, we're not talking about your job or your salary. We're talking about the assets that you own. Wealth is about physical assets. In this country, the UK, and in most Western countries, the largest single form of wealth in terms of value is residential property. So I'm talking to you from a flat that I own. You're probably watching this from a flat or apartment that you own or you rent. This country and this world is full of residential properties. They are all owned. That's the single biggest form of wealth. People are used to this kind of wealth because most people either own a property or aspire to one day own a property. It's a form of wealth that we understand. It's important to understand that residential property is not the only form of wealth. There are other huge forms of wealth, and if you want to understand them, just walk down your high street and have a look around. So I'm talking to you from Canary Wharf. Just around the corner, there's a ton of massive skyscrapers full of offices. Those are all owned. If you go down the high street, you'll see supermarkets, shopping centres, bars, restaurants. Those are all owned as well. If you go out into the countryside, you'll see farmland, that's all owned. If you live in a part of the world that has factories, you'll see factories full of machinery. That's another big source of wealth. Natural resources such as oil, coal, the windmills that produce our energy. These are all kinds of wealth. So the world is absolutely full of wealth. One other big source of wealth is debt. So if you own your own property, there's a big chance that you are owning it with a mortgage. Somebody owns your mortgage. So if you own a property worth £500,000 with a £400,000 mortgage, effectively you only own 20% of your property and the other 80% is owned by the person who lent you the money. There's also an enormous amount of government debt in this country, the UK, and many other countries. All of this debt is owed to somebody, is owned by somebody. Debt is another massive form of wealth. So I want to cover words quickly because I think sometimes words are used in a way that confuses what wealth is. Wealth is not income. Income is your salary from your work. Wealth is about ownership of assets. Capital, assets, these are all basically interchangeable. Wealth, capital, assets, these are fixed assets, property that you can own. That's wealth. Money is not the same as wealth. Money is one specific kind of wealth. A lot of people who are extremely rich don't have a huge amount of money. For very rich people, money is generally only a tiny percentage of their wealth. So that's it. Wealth is assets. Wealth is property. I think for most ordinary people, because they struggle even to own just the home that they live in, they tend not to understand that the world is full of wealth, commercial wealth in many cases, that they generally don't own much of. So that moves us on to the next point, which is who owns the wealth and how. So there are lots of different forms of wealth. And I want to separate residential property from commercial wealth and debt because the way that these are owned are very different. Now, in this country, the UK, and in also the United States, Europe, Australia, all of the places where these videos are watched, we still have a relatively large property-owning middle class, by which I mean people who are not particularly rich, but they own the property that they live in. Now, that makes residential property quite unusual because it's the only form of wealth where a large amount of ordinary people own a big chunk of the wealth that exists. When it comes to other wealth, like commercial property or debt, mortgage debt, government debt, those forms of wealth are overwhelmingly owned by very rich people. Now, we sometimes get comments on the video saying, well, that's not true because ordinary people do own commercial wealth, for example, in their pension funds. And that is true. If you have a pension, your pension will basically invest in owning corporations, which will often own commercial property. Or it will own, for example, government debt. If you have a large amount of cash in the bank, your bank will essentially be owning forms of debt for you, like government debt. But there's a big difference in the sense that when it comes to residential property, a huge amount of it is owned by normal people. Whereas when we look at commercial property, even though ordinary people do own some through, for example, their pension fund, it is tiny compared to the amount owned by the very rich. Now, very rich people, what they will tend to have is they'll have what's called a family office, and that's basically a small business which will hire lawyers and accountants, which basically manages the ownership of assets. They will own businesses, land, commercial property, huge amounts of stocks and shares. They will own debt, and that will all be managed for them. So there's kind of a split where residential property is often owned by ordinary families, although often through large amounts of debt, whereas all the other forms of wealth, commercial wealth, corporations, debt, tend to be overwhelmingly owned by the rich. Okay, so that's a setup. There's a huge amount of wealth in the world: residential property, commercial property, natural resources, land. But ordinary families are only really owning the residential property. The rest of the assets, a tiny bit is owned by ordinary families through their pensions, and the rest is owned largely by the rich. I want to talk about the cash flows that this creates in society. So every single time you use an asset, you use a piece of wealth that you don't own, you have to pay some money to the owner of that asset, the owner of that wealth. The most obvious example of this is if you rent the property that you live in, every month you have to pay rent to the owner of that property. If you own the property that you live in, but with a mortgage, every month you have to pay the mortgage interest to the owner of the mortgage. But it goes beyond just property, right? Say you go to the hairdressers to get your hair cut. The money that you pay doesn't all go to the guy that cut your hair. Some of it will go to the person who owns the building that the hairdresser is in. Some of it will go to the person who lent a business loan to that hairdresser to get started. If you go to the supermarket and you buy food in the supermarket, most of the money that you pay to buy that food will not go to the workers in the supermarket. Some of it will go to the owners of the land where that food was grown. Some of it will go to the owners of the physical building that the supermarket is in. Some of it will go to the shareholders of the company, the owners of the supermarket company itself. And this extends to every single purchase that you make. When you go take a flight to go on holiday, that doesn't mainly go to the workers of the airline, it goes to the owners of the planes, it goes to the owners of the airports. So every single time you spend money, you are giving a bit of money to the owners of the wealth, the owners of the assets. Even when you pay your taxes, a big chunk of that is going to pay debt interest to the people who lent money to the government. So even then, a big chunk of the money that you're paying is going to the owners of the wealth. Now, the reason this is important is because in many cases, the wealth that you're accessing is wealth that you literally need to live. It's access to a property, it's food, it's electricity, energy, basic transport. So what this means is, in many cases, your whole salary, or a massive chunk of it, can go towards accessing the wealth that you need to live. So if you have a salary of £30,000, £40,000 a year, very easily, £20,000, £30,000 of it can end up going to the owners of the assets that you need to live your life. So this creates a massive cash flow. Every single year, you are paying a big chunk of your salary to the owners of the wealth. On the flip side of it, the people who own the wealth are receiving a massive cash flow from you every year. So if we consider, for example, Rishi Sunak, who's worth estimated £700 million, he will receive about £2-3 million a year in pure cash flows from the wealth that he owns. That means assets that he owns, and when you use them, you have to pay him to use them. So we have this massive cash flow going on from people who don't own wealth to people who own huge amounts of wealth. What does that mean, and what does that create in terms of flows of wealth itself? Well, again, let's use our favorite man at the moment, Rishi Sunak. He's receiving £3 million a year, every single year, because of the wealth that he owns, from you, from other ordinary families. Now, what will Rishi Sunak do with that money? Now, very wealthy people, they don't generally like to accumulate money. When their pile of money grows, they like to diversify that into owning more forms of wealth. Now, in a strong economy with lots of growth opportunities, this isn't necessarily a bad thing because they can use that money to make new investments and create new forms of wealth. But when we have a weak economy with a weak consumer, companies are unwilling to grow. And that means wealthy people tend to use this very large income to buy more of the existing wealth. So you can see this creates a troubling dynamic, right? Every year, ordinary families go to work, they get their salary, they give most of their salary to the rich, and the rich use that money to buy the existing assets from ordinary families. That means that next year, ordinary families have less assets, rich families have more assets, which means ordinary families give a larger amount of cash to the rich, which means they can use that to buy even more assets from ordinary families. This can create a dangerous spiral where money gets sucked away from ordinary families and rich families accumulate money. The way that these ordinary families tend to lose that wealth is that the older generation sells the property to pay for their retirement and the younger generation never gets property. Now, if you consider these ordinary families from a generational perspective, you can see they're going from being property owning to not property owning. But the older generation sees, we got property and now we're selling it to pay for our retirement. And the younger generation simply sees, we can't afford to get a property. It's important to ask, where are those properties going? And in many cases, this is the manifestation of those flows of cash from the ordinary families to the rich. The rich accumulate that money, they give that money to their kids, and then their kids buy the property that your kids then cannot afford. Or, in other cases, they lend the money, which your kids then have to borrow. So what you see is this increase in wealth inequality, which is balancing those flows of cash from ordinary families to the rich, is manifesting in two main ways, which is number one, a smaller percentage of ordinary families being able to own properties, and number two, those who do get properties having to borrow much more money from the rich to get it. What this means is that the next generation has to spend more time renting and pay a large amount of interest. But both generations, if they look at themselves in isolation, they see themselves getting richer over time. But if they were to compare themselves with their kids and their parents, what you see is ordinary families getting poorer generation after generation after generation. So this brings us to the question of, how do people get rich? Now, I think ordinary families and ordinary people tend to think the best way to get rich is through working. And I am somebody who did get rich through working. But the reality of the situation is, it is almost impossible to get as rich through working as you can ever get by simply compounding wealth and getting more and more wealth over time. So if you are as rich as Rishi Sunak, £700 million, you will make every single year £3 to £4 million, something like that, just for getting out of bed. That will then grow and you will have more wealth the next year and it will compound up. I think it was Albert Einstein that said, compound interest is the greatest force in the world, or it's often attributed to him. But this is the way that it works. Rich people get a huge amount of money from you for being rich, and then they use that money to then buy your assets, which means they get more money from you, which they can then use to buy even more of your assets. And over time, you see wealth get sucked out of the middle class, bit by bit, in the forms of losing their homes, not being able to accumulate pensions, and having much larger amounts of debt. Now, this was the dynamic which I kind of recognized back in 2011, which enabled me to predict that basically our economy would never recover, because you could see that ordinary families were losing more and more and more wealth. That means that they will not be able to spend money. That means that ordinary businesses will fail. That means that ordinary people's wages will fall over time. So I think once you understand the flows of wealth, you can see that our middle class will shrink, living standards will shrink, and the economy will continue to fail. And this is the realization I had back in 2011. And it was also the realization I had in 2020 when COVID happened. Because you could see that the wealthy were going to get massively more rich. If you know the way that the rich behave, you will know they will use that money to buy assets from the middle class. That will increase inequality more, and that will lead this spiral to accelerate. So when you look at the whole picture, what you can see is that the situation is basically phenomenally bleak, because if in the absence of any action being taken, it has become inevitable that ordinary families and the existing middle class will over time lose all of their assets. And that will happen generationally. So it'll be difficult for you to see it as an individual, but if you compare yourself to your parents and your kids and your grandkids, you will see each generation getting poorer over time. And that will lead inevitably to more and more falling living standards. And we can see it. We can see it happening now. As inequality increases, the rich get richer, ordinary families lose their assets, and the middle class becomes poorer. That hits the economy. So I think if you look at the flows of wealth, you can understand really clearly that things will inevitably get worse and worse. It's important to understand that most economists do not look at this because it's simply not included in economics degrees. Economists tend not to look at the wealth distribution or understand who has wealth, which different groups have wealth. And that means that they will probably not understand that this is going to happen before it's too late. That is a very bleak message, but it's important that you understand that is what's going to happen. The rich will get richer because of the large amounts of wealth flowing to them, and the middle class will disappear. The reason it's important that you understand it is because, number one, you can try to protect yourself. What can you do as individuals? Well, the main thing you can do is try and reduce your spending as much as possible. I understand that in many cases that is not possible. Most people are already at bare minimum. In other cases, that means giving up, the few luxuries you have in life. That's not a message I want to send. But there is an alternative. We can try to prevent this massive flow of wealth. We can try and reverse it. I think it's important to understand if we don't reverse that flow of wealth, it is inevitable that living standards will decline aggressively in this country and in other countries around the world. So really, we've got a choice. Either start wealth flowing back from the rich to ordinary families, which would involve getting rid of tax loopholes, greater taxation of wealth rather than income, focused taxation on the rich, or we have to accept basically the middle class will disappear and a collapse into broad poverty in this country, the UK, in Western Europe, in the US. That is inevitable. I'm a betting man, I'm a trading man. I bet every year on what will happen. If you understand the flows of wealth, I think basically with certainty there will be a collapse into poverty. But at the same time, the rich will get massively richer, so asset prices will become very expensive. That's very monetizable. I bet every year on big increases in asset prices. But it will be a disaster, basically. So really, I would encourage you to help us try and stop this from happening, because I make money betting on this year after year, but I'd probably prefer if the disaster didn't happen, because it will be terrible for our society and for our kids. And the only way to stop that is to basically force governments to raise tax on the rich, because if we don't do that, things will get worse and worse. In many cases, the governments are controlled, or in this case, we have a prime minister who directly is some of the richest people in the world. They're not going to do it unless we make them do it. So we're going to keep trying to push for a reduction in inequality. If we don't do that, there will be disastrous collapse in living standards. We don't want that to happen. We don't think you want that to happen either. So support us, help grow the channel, and let's try and stop the disaster before it gets any worse. Thank you.
Money currently is flowing from the government to the rich, leaving the government with big piles of debt and the rich with big piles of money.
There is one other thing they can do with that massive amount of income. They can buy your mum's house.